I watch TV shows based on, if somebody like Michael Sharp tells me they're good.
Every writer knows that the best conversations about writing don't happen in classrooms or symposia or any other fancy artisanal setting. They happen at the bar, usually after deadline. That's the vibe we're going for here. This is The Other 51, a podcast about writing. I'm Dr. Brian Moritz. Today's guest is Doug Schneider from USA Today Network, Wisconsin. Doug Schneider, welcome to The Other 51. Thanks for joining me this week.
It's about time. How long have we been talking about doing this?
At least a year and a half. It usually comes up over Rudy's. But if we recorded it at Rudy's, we'd have less time to eat Rudy's.
Great point.
So it has been too long since we have been talking about doing this for a while, and I'm glad to have you here. Got a lot of fun stuff to talk. Well, fun stuff to talk about, interesting stuff to talk about. I don't know if an unsolved murder or solved murder is fun. But before we get to that, just out of curiosity, how many times this week or in the past week or so has somebody asked you now for real, did Steve Avery do it?
Shockingly, zero.
Really?
It was funny because that's all everybody wanted to know after the first season of Making a Murderer, which it happened in our backyard and we've covered extensively. Even the radio host that you tell, I can't answer that question because I didn't cover the trial. That was their second question, but now it's kind of like, as we were talking before we started recording, it's kind of like a political debate. The audience already knows which side it's on and which side it believes in, and they don't seem particularly interested in hearing from the side who disagrees with them.
Right. And we'll get into what it's like for you to write about Making a Murderer and the case and the documentary and all of the stuff that goes along with it. But first of all, just kind of wanted to let you talk a little bit about your career path, and how you got to, joining me at Rudy's every year to talk to my students at Oswego and working out in Wisconsin for the USA Today Network, Wisconsin. Kind of, how'd you get there from here?
Well, I'm originally from the Midwest. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. I went to school at Syracuse and spent time, like a lot of us, at small papers, kind of working my way up around New York State. You and I obviously met in Binghamton. I spent 10 years there. I started as a, night Cops general assignment reporter, worked my way up to Metro editor and then special projects editor. And then 8 years ago or so, I decided it was good to get back closer to home. So I knew the editor out here. He was a guy I'd worked with in New York. Green Bay's a place, we'd had a summer house up here forever. It was a good situation, and it was great to be here. And I like the Packers, so that didn't hurt. But the typical newspaper career for guys in our age range, you start someplace small and you go bigger places, and if you do okay, you keep moving up, and eventually you find a community in a paper of the size that you like and want to put down some roots there.
So aside from it being kind of like a personal place for you, and nice beat down your Packers gave my bills, although joined the club this year. What about this market and this size paper, like you just said, what about that kind of spoke to you, and what makes you comfortable at a paper in a market this size?
The thing I tell people is that it's big enough that there's a lot going on, but not so big that it's overwhelming. And it helps that the quality of life is really good. It's a city of 100,000, a county of about 260, but because of the NFL team, the infrastructure is built for an extra 80,000. So on a good day, my work commute's 13 minutes, and a bad day, it's 14 minutes. Those are things that big city people will hate. It's not, you don't have some of the big city challenges, parking, traffic, crime. We can walk the things that we cover. We're right downtown. And you can really do a deep dive into your beat when you're able to focus on your beat. The downside is that we're not so big that we don't have to cover a range of things and drop things and do different things. I'm working on a couple projects right now. I'm doing a podcast. I've done some sports things, even though I'm not a sports writer, but that side of my brain and that ADD part of my personality is fine with that. I enjoy it most of the time.
And you mentioned we met in Binghamton back in 2004 is when I got hired out there, and you were there. And we worked together for just about all 5 years that I was at the Press. And looking back at your time there, and I've had a couple of our other former coworkers on the podcast as well, what made Binghamton such a... I mean, for all the Binghamton-ness, and I make jokes about Binghamton like a lot of people, but it was an interesting place to work and an interesting market, an interesting town to be a newspaper reporter in. And from your perspective, what made it a different, interesting, unique place to work?
It was the best town for news in which I've ever been. All kinds of stuff happened there. Some of it great, some of it horrible. I mean, we both had a front row seat for the Division I basketball program's implosion. We had great stories. We had horrible stories. The flood of '06, which was a 300-year flood. It's the kind of stuff where you can do great journalism work. We had a mass murder, and I don't want to say I enjoyed covering that, but it's the kind of thing where you can do journalism that makes a difference. And again, it's a community where it was big enough that stuff was happening and there was some diversity. It had some economic challenges, so you had haves and have-nots, but it wasn't so big that you were isolated from the people making decisions. I also think that Binghamton was a place, I don't know whether it was the size or the editors or what, but we had some very good people come through there. Brad Heath and Steve Riley, who are both on the USA Today investigations team now, both cut their teeth there. It's funny because I had a little bit of a role in helping hire Steve, and Brad helped me get hired. So there was that kind of thing. We tended not to have, it was a place that separated the people who were good and really wanted to work hard, because it wasn't easy. And if you weren't up to the task, you found out pretty quickly, and you probably decided to leave. But the people who hung in and did good work were able to launch to, metro dailies in Detroit and Baltimore and Rochester and New York City. And it was just a very good environment. We had some editors. The guys who hired me were great about giving people a chance. Okay, you haven't done this before. You want to be an editor, try it out, see what you think. If you're really screwing up, they give you some guidance. El Vieira, a guy we both worked for who oversaw the sports department, would not take, we can't do this because we're not big enough. You'll remember his vision for covering Binghamton U was like, hey, cover them like they're Duke.
Right.
And that's a way, even if you aim high, even if you fall short, you can still do some pretty darn good work. And we saw that where we we won the ONA, whatever the first prize was in 2009, even though we're like a 40,000 circulation daily newspaper. We beat all the big guys. We clean up in the New York AP contests, and it was an energizing place to work. It was always interesting, and there wasn't too much time to coast, and I kind of liked that.
Do you? I've been out of newsrooms going on 10 years now. That kind of what you describe for a Binghamton newsroom, does that still exist in newsrooms these days?
That's a tough one. I'm sure it does. I don't know, specifically of an example like that. My sense is in upstate New York, Glens Falls is probably like that, just because I know some of the people there and I see some of the product, and they don't hesitate to aim high. I'm also a little bit removed because a lot of what I do now is kind of project-y, so I might be working out of the newsroom or working from home or something, working from a conference room on a different floor. I'm sure it does, but some of the daily grinding has gone away. You're not going to board meetings, committee meetings all the time because they just don't generate a whole lot of news. The competition is still there, but I think people have a better understanding now that, just because TV has a story doesn't mean it's really a story that your readers care about. Everybody's kind of on the broadcast side, at least in a market like ours, is kind of locked into a format. You know what they're going to do and the stories they're going to do, and if it's a press conference or a political appearance, they're going to go to it and do it daily. But it's pretty much, hey, we've decided that this is what our audience wants, and we're going to deliver it for them. I gotta believe, some of the sports websites and competitive environments are like that. If you're at ESPN, or CBS, you're probably sprinting every day.
So the one of the I know the big stories when we talked about this before we recorded. We've mentioned it a few times, but the Making a Murderer series happening up in your neck of the woods, and I know you have a new podcast out, which is really good. I'll put the link to it in show notes. People should check that out. And you've been writing about kind of both the ongoing story, the ongoing legal story, and the kind of the hype around the documentary itself. But I want to go back because the actual cases happened in like the mid 2000s, and you were working that's when we were in Binghamton. So it's not something that I'm guessing, did you know anything about Steve Avery before the documentary stuff all started?
I knew nothing about Stephen Avery until people said, you really got to watch this thing called Making a Murderer. Huh. I mean, it happened in one county over from us, and it was over and done with a long time ago. I mean, we have in our group, we have a Milwaukee reporter who covered the trial, but pretty much everybody else on the team is new to us since then. And I think we started to get to this question earlier on, but you kind of tend to ask how things have changed. The Making a Murderer coverage is a perfect example of that, because it used to be, if you and I are working in a newspaper in Binghamton or Olean or Oswego or wherever, your audience is geographic. It's that county or that area code or that city or something. Well, now we've got a local audience that knows the players and knows the story, but we've also got a national audience and an international audience. And so, you might be writing for somebody in Australia as much as you're writing for somebody in Green Bay. And that, it's interesting to have a greater reach, but it's also a little bit of a challenge because, just kind of being able to understand a place like Manitowoc County and this is how big it is, and this is what the communities are like. If you're on the other side of the globe, you don't have any of that kind of perspective. So maybe if you're writing something or doing a video on that, you have to do some explaining, but then your local audience is like, why are you telling me this? I know it already.
Right. And like we were talking about earlier, writing it in a way that's kind of accurate to the area and doesn't play to the stereotypes that I think I don't know if they deliberately emerged or kind of inadvertently emerged from at least the first season of Making a Murderer about Manitowoc County and what it's like. And like you were saying before, it's not necessarily what it's all like it's portrayed in the documentary.
Right. I remember once David Simon, whose work I love, said about Homicide or The Wire that the city of Baltimore is a character in those series. And Manitowoc County is very much a character in Making a Murderer, especially in the first season, which they call Part 1. Certainly there were images chosen to focus on the bleakness and the barrenness and the, absence of hope message that, conveyed kind of the perspective from the people who'd lost something in that. But it's also, it's a lakefront community. The ice cream sundae was invented in Manitowoc County. It's, a place where you could go to the beach. There's some cool places and things to do. And obviously we don't see that. And the people who live there, as one would expect, in a lot of cases, got very, very sick of being portrayed as rubes and, we only believe the cops and we treat people like the Averys terribly all the time. That's hard to be. Your sheriff's office is getting emails from around the globe, and some of them are going to the mayor because people don't know that Manitowoc County is different from the city of Manitowoc, and you guys are horrible, and, I'll never spend a dime in your community, and I'll just say bad things about it. And, that's awful, but that tends to be the way things happen when they become larger than life and they're portrayed. And I don't think the filmmakers set out to necessarily do that, but you've got to pick a point of view at some point. And the way they were trying to tell the story, you look at the opening credits and there's, empty farm fields and snow blowing across the road and a hulking factory that's no longer there with a school bus driving behind it. You get a very, very quick picture of it. And yeah, it's not the Silicon Valley, but it's a very real community that's got a lot of Wisconsin strengths in it, a vibrant, dairy farming, cheese making, beer drinking kind of, all the stuff that, Wisconsin prides itself on. There's a lot of good stuff there too.
Yeah. I'm wondering, so what was it like when, like, the documentary, because it was kind of a slow burn when it came up, not related to the podcast with the same name, but it was kind of it was the word of mouth that, like, kind of, when it started to, when Part 1, as they call it, kind of started to gather momentum and get attention. And what was it like being up there and do you remember kind of like when you guys kind of collectively, professionally realized, oh, this is a thing and we're going to have to start writing about it?
You ever been on a really tall roller coaster?
No, I'm scared of roller coasters. So,
okay, if you can imagine that there's a long, slow climb to the top, and the anticipation is building, and you're getting goosebumps, and your palms are getting sweaty, and then you crest that peak, and all of a sudden you're bombing downhill at what feels like 90 miles an hour. This was kind of like that. Again, off air, we were talking about, I'm not a crazy TV watcher. I like to watch good TV, but I don't like to try stuff that, it could bomb. So I usually wait for my friends to say, hey, you should watch this series because it's, you should watch Breaking Bad because it's amazing. And with this, I'd heard people kind of talking about it, but then all of a sudden one day, and early in the year, the thing had been out for I don't know, a month or so. One of the editors came by and said, okay, we need to start writing daily stories on this phenomenon. And they had myself and a featured writer at our paper in Appleton writing kind of just looking at what media was doing with this around the country and around the globe. And you're looking at this, and there were days when you wrote, you could write a 30-inch story that's basically just a sentence or two and a link to something that somebody in New Zealand was writing about this. And it was amazing. And the page view numbers on those stories were out of sight. And all of a sudden it's a month or two later and you're realizing that that's been pretty much all you're doing. And everything's just kind of whooshing by you because it's happening so fast. And the journalists all over are looking for angles, and they're retelling the story, and then it becomes a thing where Reddit gets involved, and people on there are they're plowing through thousands of pages of documents and looking for photos, and there's a cut on Stephen Avery's hand in this picture. What does that mean? Or the ex-boyfriend on the sign-in sheet for the search his name is misspelled. Was he trying to mislead people? And you're going, there weren't enough hours in the day to go down all those angles. It was like nothing I've ever been a part of. And, at times that, you don't even really have time to step back and think, as in a big story, you don't have time to, say, okay, how does this look from 30,000 feet? Well, we were able to sort of back off the daily stuff and say, okay, a couple of reporters are going to focus on this. And then Shane and I, the other guy who was on the team, started working on a podcast. And, we put together a number of episodes. Yeah, the idea was to be smart about making a murder and not, have debates about, is this guy guilty or not, but to pick out some of the issues it raises, the interrogation of a mentally challenged 16-year-old. Is that unjust, or does the fact that eventually the cops elicited a statement, an admission from him, does the end justify the means, and things like that? And that was a lot of fun. And then season 2 didn't happen. It didn't happen. And then we kind of sat there, and it finally dropped about the time we were starting to wonder if there was going to be one. And then we're back at it again. We just recorded another podcast episode yesterday. It'll drop on Thursday, I believe, and we'll be cranking out a new one every week as long as the interest is there.
What are the challenges, especially now that the story's been out there and the documentary's been out there and there's part 2 now? What's the challenge for you? What's the biggest challenge about writing about something like Making a Murderer?
I don't know if there's one biggest one. A couple that come to mind. I mentioned the audience. Okay, who are you writing for? I say I work for a newspaper, but in reality, I work for a multimedia organization, and certainly most of our audience and our audience priority is online. So am I writing for one of my neighbors in Green Bay, or am I writing for people where we used to live in upstate New York, or am I writing for people in a country that speak a different language? So you periodically have to have that discussion with yourself. There is, as there can be with any big story, especially around ground zero, there is coverage fatigue. The last thing a lot of people in Manitowoc County or in northeastern Wisconsin want to do is log on to the website or pick up the newspaper and say, oh, here's another story about this. We all have stories like that. There are things that, you get sick of reading, and, the day-to-day coverage of the president, I say, okay, I got to read this because it's important, but you want to break from some of that stuff. And so you can get, that the audience is so engaged that people will send you emails, I got this theory, what do you think? And like, well, first of all, I didn't sit through weeks of trial and hear all the evidence, and I don't know. And, you're way down a rabbit hole that I don't have time to go down. And my opinion really doesn't matter. It's up to the courts, it's up to the attorneys, it's up to the system in a way. We can examine that and write about it, but I don't have the ability to test your theory that aliens came down in a spaceship, did something, or I'm exaggerating, but there's some of that. But it's really, as you know, a lot of what we do in journalism is you're covering a story one day and you've never covered anything like it before. And, maybe it's maybe it's the 2000 election, maybe it's 9/11, maybe it's a mass murder. But you're learning as you're doing, and you're trying to do the best work that you can do and be respectful of your audience in terms of giving them what you need, but not hitting them over the head with things. And then when you're done, you say, holy cow, I learned a lot. And now the next time it happens, I'm ready.
So moving away from the Making Murderer, and to the other thing that people know you for, Scanner Squawk. How did that start?
It was the best of times. It was I mean, it actually started, for the uninitiated, and how could you possibly not know about this? It's a hashtag that represents weird stuff you hear on the police scanner, and police scanners are a staple of newsrooms everywhere. It's how you get a jump on breaking news, or you hear, you get an early look if there's a problem developing in your community. It may be traffic, it may be whatever. And over the years, you just hear some ridiculous stuff out of context, and a lot of it is funny. And so a Gannett colleague of mine, Esteban Parra, who's a veteran reporter at the News Journal in Wilmington, Delaware, started doing it, and he just has a great ear for all kinds of funny stuff, and I loved it, and started doing a little of that. And if you can imagine what the scanner sounds like when you've got 80,000 crazed Packers fans in a city of 100,000 on a game day, when the tailgating starts about the time the sun comes up, you can hear some pretty funny and pretty outrageous stuff. And we started tweeting that, and people are jumping on board. They share it with their friends out of town, and you occasionally get the other team's beat writers retweeting you and things like that. And then one day I woke up in Deadspin and run a story about it, and my Twitter followers look like the dial on an analog gas pump, a Vegas slot machine, because Barry Barry Pachetsky there, who's a cool guy, had decided to write about it. So a lot of people are jumping on board, and now one of the great things about it is this community has developed around it organically. We have people, an emergency room nurse from Minnesota does, an over-under and odds on the first state that of the person who's going to be ejected first. A guy composes haiku, and there's actually a guy, he's a crime novelist in Finland who will take the best tweets and translate them. So periodically during the day, somebody will say, hey, Yarko, a cop just used the term puke people. What will that look like in Finnish? And, a couple minutes later, it'll come back with a tweet. And it's just amazing. And it's been great. I've gotten to meet some people out. I was at a ball game once, and a guy's like, oh, let's take a selfie. And I'm like, wow, this thing has really gotten out of hand. And I used to do it kind of in my spare time, but eventually my employers were like, hey, let's dedicate some time and space to it, because it's just one more way that people can engage around the Packers. And if you haven't, maybe South Bend is like this around Notre Dame football. Maybe Tuscaloosa is like this with Alabama, but Central New York, you take like Syracuse fandom and multiply it by at least 100 and maybe more. So it's one more way people can connect around the team, and we have a good time with it. If we ignore the occasional troll from the out of town markets, and we're nice to opposing fans and things like that. It's been a lot of fun. Met some people, made some friends, and it's a chance to do something different. And invariably, there's just some weird tweet. A friend tweeted me yesterday and said, it's the 7th anniversary of the Scanner Squawk, where somebody called the cops to complain that an engineer had parked his locomotive and walked over to a bar to get drunk. and some of it, it's the Wisconsin-ness of things. People, there's a reason beer is brewed here, because it's a market, and people really like to have a good time, and they don't mind doing it in the cold weather, and you get a lot of funny stuff, but it's also a chance to get a message out about, hey, if you've had too much, here are your options for getting home, and be respectful of the other people in the stadium, because you've got the element of idiots like you have at any NFL game. And you try and tamp that down and remind people that they can have a good time without wrecking it for others. And hope it doesn't go too far, but it's become a thing, and we'll do it for the foreseeable future.
I ask everybody I have on the show this, so I'll ask you, what's the best thing you've read lately?
There isn't one best thing. Aha! I got another qualified answer. I think that the work that the Times did on, I'm not going to go straight books because everybody does that the Times did on the Trump family's finances.
Oh, that was so good.
Amazing reportage. I think they could have packaged it better. It might have worked better across a couple of days, and they probably should have shared excerpts ahead of time. But it was just tremendous reporting. The Post has done good stuff. Read the story about the guy with the opiate addiction that developed from a chronic injury, and now he's driving across the state of Washington once a month to see the one pain specialist who will still see him, and she's about to go out of business. The Athletic, your favorite website, did a tremendous look at 4 days on the road with a crappy East Coast League hockey team in the middle of winter. Fantastic read by a kid I think is all of 22. I know it's a list, and I apologize you can't pick one. You had Perlman on. His book about the USFL is amazing.
It's so good. I'm in the middle of it right now. It is so good.
It really is. I'd read, because I knew he was working on a book on Favre, so I grabbed his Dallas Cowboys book, and that was amazing. If you need a reason to dislike the Cowboys anymore. And I still haven't read the Favre book, because every time somebody in our office finishes it, somebody grabs it. I've never seen a guy report like that in a book. I try and vary what I'm reading, so I grabbed an investigative work when I was down in New Orleans called Shots on the Bridge. It's about the cops who went rogue post-Katrina, written by a guy named Ronnie Green. It's terrifyingly good. And then in a cut-up bin, I found something called Chasing Phil, where a guy got a couple hundred pages about two young FBI agents who go on the trail of like the world's best and nicest con man. And they're, it's a garbage assignment. It's like, hey, we got to throw the interns on this, so we'll give them this and keep them out of our hair. And they start making headway, so they stay on it and they build a case, and over and over and over. It's a wonderful read about a really weird thing. So a lot of good stuff out there now. I tend to read in fits and starts, and lately I've been a little bit exhausted, so I haven't done much. But there's the thing I could have mentioned, USA Today piece a couple of weeks ago about a day in the life of teachers around America. Read that. It will eliminate a lot of stereotypes about teachers, and there's some amazing anecdotes in that. So a lot of good stuff out there. What's the best thing you've read?
So the Perlman book, I'm in the middle of about 3 different books right now. So the Perlman book is definitely one of that. I am going to finish on this Run from the Library, Grant by Chernow. I've been reading that thing for most of the year, and it's splendid. It's a beautifully done book, but it's well over 1,000 pages before footnotes. And so that's just the and it's small type, 1,000 pages too. So that's just work getting through kind of physically. But those are the best 2 things that I've read. I have seen, on The Athletic, let's throw a story out here. Matthew Fairburn, who does great work covering the Bills. He's been a guest on here. He did a breakdown with Joe Licata, who's a former University of Buffalo quarterback. And does some coaching and stuff. And they did a film breakdown of basically why the Bills quarterback play in the Texans game was so awful, and what he's seeing from Josh Allen in the pocket, and broke down that Peterman pick six. And I think that's a really great way of covering of writing about football and about writing about sports that's not widely done. You kind of get an independent person to look at, because you can get the All 22, the coach's film, and have them break it down and kind of see no, you don't know for sure, obviously, but this is an expert opinion watching this. This is what they see, and it's some really good. It was really well done. I think it's a really interesting way to look at, to further break down a game and something we've been talking about for 4 days now, but it does it you learn something from reading that, which I thought was really cool.
No, I think that's a great point. They do take a smart approach to things like that, and that's something that their platform lends itself to.
Definitely. Doug, this was a lot of fun catching up. I appreciate you taking the time this week.
Yeah, let's do it again sometime, or at least hit Rudy's in the spring.
As always, thanks for listening to The Other 51. You can find show notes for this episode and all our episodes at sportsmediaguy.com on the Other 51 tab. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. I can highly recommend Overcast for this. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.